Welcome! Continuing our series looking at each of the classes and specs before Shadowlands, we're going to do things a little bit differently this time. Now that pre-patch is here, I think it would be more useful to you all if we talk about the important changes to the classes, but also do a quick look at talent choices and rotations to get you comfortable with your class for Shadowlands. This isn't meant to be a guide covering every little nuance of the spec, but instead a quick reference you can use if you want to try out something new or you just want to have a good idea of what you're doing with a class. So in other words, I'll comb through the guides and condense the information for you so you can just get to playing the game. In a future video, I'll talk specifically about how to become a better player and give you the tools you need to play every class and spec very well. Give a man a fish and feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and feed him for a lifetime. Let's talk about the changes. What are the important changes that you need to concern yourself with for Unholy? I'm not talking about numbers tuning. These are just foundational changes to Unholy. The runes finally got an overhaul, and these are the choices we have now. Nothing changes very much for Unholy DK for the rune choice. Your endgame go-to rune will likely still be Rune of the Fallen Crusader because that 15% main stat is just super good. Other runes you should pay attention to are Rune of the Unending Thirst for leveling. This will increase your base move speed, and you'll get a bonus move speed and haste buff whenever you kill an enemy. And other runes are not really useful for Unholy. They're either too RNG or the math hasn't been done to determine whether it'll ultimately be better than Rune of the Fallen Crusader, but it's gonna be hard to beat that 15% strength buff. New abilities, the unpruning is finally here, and Unholy is impacted probably the least from these changes. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing because the baseline abilities we have are now very useful. One of those is Anti-Magic Zone. It is the new star of the Death Knight, being a must-have raid CD. Reduces magic damage taken by 20% by every safe little bubble boy in the zone for 10 seconds. One new addition is Lichborn, which makes you undead for 10 seconds, increases your leech, and makes you immune to charm, fear, and sleep, which will indefinitely have some use cases in a variety of Shadowlands content. Another niche case for this ability is to turn yourself undead and couple it with Death Coil to heal yourself in a desperate situation when you aren't in range for your death strike. Finally, for new abilities, we have Sacrificial Pact, which will sacrifice your ghoul to deal damage to 8 nearby enemies or heal yourself for 25% of your max health. This ability becomes available at level 54. Now let's talk about some general ability changes. Epidemic has come out of the talents, and we can now unlock it at level 34. It is effectively your AoE Death Coil. Sudden Doom will also now make your Epidemic have a chance to cost no runic power. Death and Decay got hit with that dreaded target cap. While you stand in Death and Decay, your Scourge Strike will hit up to 4 nearby enemies. This means you'll be hitting a total of 5, which is your main target, plus 4 additional enemies. Ultimately, Unholy is going to be an AoE burst powerhouse. The duration of Virulent Plague has been increased from 21 seconds to 27 seconds baseline and no longer spreads to nearby enemies. If you want an enemy to be infected with COVID Plague, you're going to have to do it yourself. Army of the Dead rune cost has been reduced to 1, down from 3. This will make the opener and mid-fight rotation a lot less cumbersome. Our mastery has gotten a tweak and now also increases the damage of your minions. And the idea of DK really getting that minion treatment brings a lot to the class fantasy. You feel almost like a demonology warrior, which is awesome, which is really fun. Minion builds rejoice. Now let's talk about ability ranks, something that is new with the level squish. A number of our abilities have been adjusted with ranks, and here's a quick overview of those abilities. Death's Advance, Apocalypse, Death Coil, Festering Strike, Scourge Strike. Now let's get into the talents. On the 15 row, nothing has changed. The 25 row sees a few changes. The first being Bursting Sores, with a target cap of 8 being put on it. New changes sees Unholy Blight, seeing a cool little rework. The damage now stacks up to 4 times, and your minions deal 3% increased damage per stack to enemies infected with Unholy Blight. More minion enhancements is great to see on this spec. On row 30, we have nothing new. On row 35, the old Soul Reaper has come back from the dead. Strike an enemy for shadow damage and afflict the enemy with Soul Reaper. After 5 seconds, if the target is below 35% health, this effect will explode, dealing additional shadow damage to the target. If the enemy dies while afflicted with Soul Reaper, gain Runic Corruption. On row 40, nothing new. On row 45, we have some good changes with a new ability, Unholy Pact, filling in for Summon Gargoyle that moved down a row. Unholy Pact causes dark transformation to create a flaming chain between you and the pet for 15 seconds, which increases strength by 5%. And Defile has an additional effect now. If any enemies are standing in Defile, it grows in size and deals increased damage every second. On row 50, Army of the Damned has seen an extra addition, Apocalypse, and Army of the Damned summon a Magus of the Dead for 15 seconds who hurls frost bolts and shadow bolts at your foes. For talent choice, if you are leveling, you're going to want to take All Will Serve, Unholy Blight, your choice, Soul Reaper, your choice, but I prefer Wraithwalk, Unholy Pact, and Unholy Assault. For single target, everything is the same as leveling except your final row where you're going to want to take Army of the Damned. And for AoE, again, everything is very similar to our leveling tree, except on your 25 row, you want to take Bursting Sores instead of Unholy Blight. Now let's talk about the rotation, your single target rotation. Army of the Dead with Bloodlust. If you are leveling, use it for elites and stronger enemies. Keep Virulent Plague on the enemies at all times and don't let it drop. Refresh with Outbreak or Unholy Blight. Dark Transformation when it's up. Unholy Frenzy if talented and you won't overcap runes, so use it at 2 or less runes. Apocalypse with 4+ stacks of Festering Wound. You can have more than 4, but absolutely no less. You summon a ghoul from your Army of the Dead per Festering Rune stack, up to a max of 4. Cast Death Coil to avoid capping runic power or consume a Sudden Doom proc. Cast Scourge Strike as long as there is 1 or more Festering Wounds on the target. Cast Festering Strike if there are no Festering Wounds on the target. And use Death Coil if you have nothing else to do. For AoE, which is 3 or more targets, maintain Virulent Plague, Dark Transformation whenever it's up, Epidemic in place of Death Coil, and it's used in the same way, Death and Decay, Scourge Strike while standing on Death and Decay and your target has at least 1 stack of Festering Wound. Then you're going to use Epidemic, Scourge Strike with 1 Festering Wound and Death and Decay isn't available, and Festering Strike if there are no Festering Wounds on the target. So essentially, I will explain it this way for AoE. In order to get the most possible damage, you want to put Festering Wounds on up to 5 targets. Then put your Death and Decay down and burst as much as possible in that Death and Decay window. Your Festering Wound will burst on all the targets it's applied to, and your Scourge Strike will cleave with prioritizing the enemies that have Festering Wounds on them. And that gives you tremendous control of the enemies that you prioritize in an AoE situation. This is where the skill barrier will really separate players. Effective prep for burst situations will really bump your damage, but also overactive application of Festering Wounds without a plan to burst them will cause you to waste resources and lose damage. And this alone makes Unholy DK a higher skill cap spec. That is our video. I really hope you enjoyed yourself and maybe learned a thing or two. Hopefully you're hyped on the Unholy DK. It really is one of the most fun specs in the game. I've been loving seeing all the newcomers to the channel. We're almost at 100 subs and I'm so happy to see it. If you want to be part of that first 100, I will love you long time. And until next time, see ya.